Well, as in many of the cenotaphs we actually find in the cities around the region of Southeast Asia, you find that it was actually built um, after the First World War in the 1920s, as you mentioned. But later on, it became also a monument dedicated to the Second World War. So maybe you can say a little bit about how that happened in the context of Singapore.
Exactly. So after the Second World War, which also massively affected large parts of Asia, including Singapore as well, the question was, how do we remember this in the urban landscape? And this was a question that especially the colonial government in Singapore posed as well. And what it wanted to do, because it was very much aware of the volatile situation that had been created during the Second World War, and the calls for self-government and independence becoming ever louder across the region, they could not go back to the practice they had practiced before, where it was only focused on the British war effort and maybe, some Commonwealth soldiers and their sacrifices tacked on. What they wanted was an all-encompassing memorial, one that would ideally also include not only the military servicemen who had died and suffered during the war, but also the civilians. So if we, for instance, look at efforts in the late 1940s, for example, the British originally envisaged it not to look like this anymore. So the other side of this memorial commemorates the First World War, so 1914 to 1918, First World War in Europe.
Yeah.
Whereas what we see right here, the steps leading up to the memorial from the back, the plaques with multilingual inscriptions, and the dates 1939 to 1945, of course, marking again the dates of the Second World War in Europe, were added only in the early 1950s as a compromise, as it turns out, because the British wanted to turn it into a memorial that would resemble more the tomb of the unknown warrior that you would find in Canberra, for example, or in London, or at least include features of these memorials. So they wanted two urns put up on each side of the memorial, one for the civilian dead, one for the military dead, and also inscribed with dates much more significant for this locale, meaning the 8th of December 1941, beginning of the invasion of Malaya, and the 5th of September 1945, which was, incidentally not the end of the Second World War, as when the Japanese were signing the Instrument of Surrender on the USS Missouri. That happened just a few days earlier, but when the British actually returned to Singapore and liberated it. So there was supposed to be this new emphasis on taking on board all people and all imperial subjects again, and bringing them back into the imperial fold symbolically. But they wanted to sound out public opinion, how this was received. So they put out things in the newspapers, in the Chinese press, and the English-speaking press as well, and received virtually no response. So the whole thing lay dormant for a couple of years, and in the early 50s, they simply decided to change the cenotaph into the form that we see today.
Why do you think there was no response from the public with regards to the cenotaph then?
Well, there are several arguments you can make here. For instance, you could say that the imperial symbolism that it offered had never any real significance for the locals. Or you could say that at the same time, late 1940s, for instance, former allies of the British, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, for example, had turned against their former allies because they realized, well, the British are sort of here to stay, at least at this point. It wasn't quite clear when they were going to leave. And they wouldn't have that, because they just put up massive resistance against the Japanese during wartime, and now they realized in order to get rid of the colonial masters altogether, which are now the British again, we need to put up a fight once more.